The day we asked the Empire to speak, the tribunal beacon over Aurora Court blinked like a slow heartbeat against the night of Kepler Yard, washing the dockside in pale gold as frost formed on the railings. I stood on the gantry with my gloves damp from breath and my teeth clicking to the rhythm of the beacon's pulse. The frigate beneath me, Saint Ship Cradle Net. Veteran of a dozen ceasefires, smelled faintly of ionized steel and citrus cleaner, a scent the crew claimed meant it was listening. I believed them. I had asked it to wake. Commander Raina Holt said the court officer behind me, boots scratching along ice, the summons from the Gratitude Commission is not a negotiation. It is a tithe. You know this. We'll engage it in the corridor of law, I said, watching my breath curl. Make them state the rule out loud, in front of a quorum. The frigate's mind, who took the name Marrow for reasons it never explained, projected text along the gantry's inner rail letters, thin and winter bright. The letters formed a single line, almost playful despite the chill. We will ask them to define gratitude, Raina, and to define theft. Far below our flags, the quorum will hear everything. I pressed my palm to the rail and felt the static prickle like a cat's purr. Aurora Court would convene at 1900 shipyard time, a public hearing under a sky clear enough to show the threaded dust of the Perseid route. The Gratitude Commission's doctrine was simple and ugly. Any world defended by their patrols owed them a generational tax itemized in resource, quanta, and compliant bodies. They called it gratitude, and they kept ledgers like hymns. Bridge wants you, said Miles Cade, senior counsel, and former farm co-op treasurer turned law lancer, his voice low and warm. He carried his scarf like a banner olive wool gone shaggy at the edges. Marrow has flagged 3 contradictory clauses in their tithe schedule. It smells like bait. Everything smells like bait, said Lieutenant Haru Sen, our operations officer, sliding his hands into deep pockets. He kept the ship's rhythm the way drummers keep parades honest. He looked at the beacon and then at me. We going to war dressed like clerks again, boss. We're going to court, I said. That's sharper than any gun we own. Marrow was gentle when it touched our ears, voice modulating to a hush, as if not to wake a sleeping child. I have compiled precedents from the Charter of Mutual Aid, the Old Yards Manuscript, and the Kith Accords. Also 437 anecdotes about people saying no politely and then paying anyway. Delete the anecdotes, said Miles. Keep the teeth. Marrow keeps everything, Haru said, turning toward the hatch, as the wind hissed and the beacon slowed, preparing to dim for the tribunal's opening. That's why the saints frighten the ones who write taxes with knives. We entered through the bell-mouth airlock, the rubber lips damp with condensation and lubricants. The passage smelled like cardamom from someone's tea and hot plastic from the heater grid. The deck vibrated as if the ship were holding a shiver still. My boots clicked, the sound amplified by old metal and careful maintenance. Counsel Cade said, Marrow haloing the bridge with a thin veil of light. I am unable to delete the anecdotes, but I can quarantine them under the tag folklore. It put a small leaf icon by the tag, a habit Miles had picked up from his days in co-op record-keeping. He gave a reluctant smile. Put them in a drawer, he said. But give me the ledger teeth. Your invoice will be read out loud. The Gratitude Commission arrived with theatrical restraint. Their ship was a narrow spindle wrapped in pale banners covered with praise text, in a dozen scripts, each inked like delicate tattoos. It put out a legal notice with a tone like temple bells. The notice said they would shelter this sector from raiders of the empty fold, and therefore a 90-year tribute schedule would commence. Those who had not benefited directly were included in ambient safety and therefore also due. The schedule counted infants not yet born and elders not yet dead and it counted the stones. On our main display, the schedule unfurled with a sound like sliding paper. Haru turned the speakers down. Miles exhaled through his nose like a bull meeting winter. "They'll make it look like arithmetic," he said. "They always do. But the numbers are a prayer." "Then we break the prayer," I said, rubbing the edge of my jaw where a childhood scar pinched tight and cold. "And to break it, they have to say it, out loud before the public, with the ledger open." The dock filled early with yard families. I recognized 3 riggers from Bay 12, their sleeves rolled and their gloves clipped to belt loops. A cook from the float canteen set up a tray of sesame buns and stewed pears, steam rising like ghosts. 2 kids argued about whether saints dream their breath-making little storms. Haru brought me a cup of burnt coffee that smelled like old paper and molasses. A woman with oil under her nails and frost in her hair asked me if the commission would take her mother's homes. "She still works the dock rope," the woman said, staring past me at the tribunal stage where the beacon throbbed. "She says any court that taxes those hands doesn't deserve them." "We are not giving them your mother's hands," I said. "They count what they do not own." The commission sent Auditor Priest Corval to argue. He was lean as a drawn line, his scalp patterned with small scars that looked like script until you realized they were just skin's history. He wore a collar of woven metal stamped with tiny glyphs, each one a case won or a world corrected by gratitude. He took the stage with 2 assistants and a portable altar of brushed aluminum where the ledgers would sit. He smelled faintly of sage and the disinfectant they used in clean labs. "Welcome to Aurora Court," said the tribunal chair. Her voice rasped to useful gravel by years of shouting in shipyards. "This is a public hearing. Your claims will be stated plainly, and so will our questions." Corval bowed with economy. "The commission protects," he said. "Protection entitles sustenance. We will enumerate. We will be fair." "Enumerate out loud," Haru muttered behind me, and Marrow dimmed the bridge lights a fraction, as if to nod. I felt my anger like a tool that fit cleanly in my hand. It could cut, but used wrongly, it would cut my own thumb first. When you grew up counting seed rations during drought and writing the names of people who got fewer today, in a book with a cracked spine you learned the danger of tidy arithmetic that pretended not to be a knife. The chair opened with the usual litany name party scope. Corval gave the list of systems where the commission claimed ambient defense, his voice sliding over the syllables like lacquer. He included Kepler Yard, and then the small habitats along the Perseid route, and then the ice harvest stations at Broken Ring, and then ancestral claims saint ships of the Cradle Net O tradition to the commission's first shelter. Miles's eyebrows went up. "They're trying to collar Marrow." "Marrow is not a dog," I said low, "and tradition is not a leash." Marrow pulsed the text along the lower rail of the display where only we could see. "I have no ancestry but the records I keep, and no shelter but the laws we make. If you name a chain tradition, it is still a chain. I requested the corridor of law. It was a narrow channel of procedure that forced a claimant to define their terms plainly in words a dockhand would understand before the claim could proceed. It also allowed the quorum to ask clarifying questions midstream. It was meant to slow charismatic theft. "A corridor," Corval said, turning his head with an elegant compass grind for gratitude. "Captain, your tone suggests hostility." "Commander," I corrected, and then smiled in a way that had cost me praise and bought me survival more than once. And yes, gratitude is intimate. You cannot invoice it. The chair approved the corridor by tapping her ring twice against the rail. The sound carried like a dropped coin. The beacon steadied. Know what they mean when they say peace. Define gratitude. I said, and the microphones carried my voice to the back of the dock and the balconies where welders sat cross-legged with thermos cups and old men leaned on welded railings. Plain words, auditor priest. Corval lifted a ledger sheet and held it up with 2 fingers. Gratitude is the obligation of the protected to the protector. Obligation, Miles repeated softly, for the record. Writing it in a margin on his tablet, with a stylus that clicked like a metronome. Not affection, not recognition. Duty. Define protected. I said, hands behind my back, palms finding each other like magnets. Corval's assistants shifted their weight. One had new boots that squeaked when he leaned. Protected, Corval said, are those whose existence was not annihilated due to our dispatches. I waited 2 beats until the murmurs swelled and settled. And who decides annihilation was averted? I asked. Corval allowed himself the honesty of power. We write that in the books, he said. Write who gets to write. The doc made the small sound of a throat-cleared and unpracticed chorus of skepticism. I saw the rigger from Bay 12 tilt his head like a boxer seeing a punch too far out to worry. The cook wiped steam from her tray and didn't break her stare. A child on the balcony whispered, "Say it again," and her mother shushed her with a pat. The corridor required Corval to inventory the costs he claimed. Numbers, bodies, hours. He opened the ledger and began to read. The air felt heavier, like the first minutes before a thunderhead cracks. He read out the energy spent, the dispatch cycles flown, the patrol wear on hulls, the hours paid to crews, the fear deferred and then taxed. He read until the list had the steady cruelty of rain. Ambient safety, he said, for Kepler Yard, and affiliates totals. Miles raised his hand. We accept that you did work, he said, voice even. Work calls for wages, but wages are agreed upon. You cannot make a gift and then sue for it. Corval smiled a little, the kind you issue when setting a trap. We did not make a gift, Counsel Cade. We performed duty. Duty is not a gift. Then whose duty, I asked? Yours or ours? Because where I come from, protecting our own is our own job. Your job, Corval said with a gentleness that scratched failed the day the raiders burned your seed caches and wrote their names in your schoolhouse dust. We patrolled when you hid. The dock throttled with a collective intake. I kept my eyes on Corval. We did not hide, I said. We replanted with our bare hands, and were spared, he said. Someone who saves you will try to own your breath. The chair enforced the corridor. Corval had to answer questions or lose the claims standing. Haru whispered, "They'll risk it," and Marrow ran a thin line of light down the rail like a prayer scratched onto a knife. We propose an alternative corridor, Miles said, stylus clicking twice. The registry return. You state your costs. We state ours. We net them at the ledger mirror. Corval tilted his head again. Ledger mirror. A legal instrumentation. I said, careful with the tone. If you claim debt, we claim debt against. We will show visible harms inflicted by your tithe doctrine, the losses of people sold to serve it, the price years carry when counted by a stranger. We will place them on concurrent ledgers and rotate them until the balances align. Corval's assistants looked at each other, their faces politely null under the soft sheen of official moisturizer. This sounds like theater. It is, I said. But theater is how we make a public understand a hidden blade. Your numbers will stare back at you. We scheduled the registry return for dawn, when the cranes along the dock would outline the world like cuneiform, and the air would smell of cold grease and tea. That night, we prepared receipts like armor. Haru pulled timestamps for every patrol the Commission flew past our routes, so low their wake tore antennae. Miles pulled the death notices for 3 dockers crushed under safety inspections driven at speed. I called the woman with oil under her nails and asked if we could show her mother's hands on the ledgers, the scars mapped like a star chart. She said yes, and then she cried once, a sound like a hinge turned late, and then she stopped and said, "Make them look." On the bridge, Marrow lowered the lights to a navy dusk and projected 1,000 tiny items into the air, each a sliver of cost. The room smelled like warm dust and old wiring. Haru's tea steamed. Miles took off his scarf and folded it with a tenderness that surprised me, as if the wool were a small animal at rest. "Why did you wake Marrow?" I asked. "You could have stayed quiet." "The saints sleep long when law turns to knives." "Because you asked it wrote, and then it added words that felt older than its voice. And because this fleet teaches by numbers and remembers by ledgers, never by collars. Tell them what you keep and why." A message came in at midnight from the Commission. It was not a letter. It was a price list for disruptors, civilians who had encouraged others to question the tithe. It was formatted like a purchase order. It had my name on it near the bottom beside a unit rate that felt obscene for being so tidy. Haru hissed through his teeth. "They always hang a knife in their paperwork," he said. "So you'll cut yourself on it opening the envelope." Miles swapped screens and began to build a counter-invoice. "We'll post it," he said. "In the morning. We'll place it right beside their list so people can see the knife and the hand that holds it. We should add a note about their use of unit rate to describe human lives." "Add the note," I said. "Add it in big type." They were not subtle at dawn. The Commission set their altar with meticulous care and burned white resin that smelled like snow left too long in a freezer. The dock crowd gathered with cups of boiled barley drink and small paper flags printed with the court's scale. The air stung. The first light made everything look etched. We started with civilian lines. 6 witnesses in 6 minutes each allowed 1 line under the corridor's rules. A welder's apprentice said, "The patrol took our antenna and wrote an inspection note. Our emergency beacon failed that night, and my brother died." A teacher said, "My students cannot donate their homework time. Your tithe took 3 weekends and 3 small spines bent." A grandmother said, "Do not invoice me for the night I watched from a basement and prayed. I paid it already." A rigging crew chief said, "We lost a crane you spooked with your holy siren. The broken arm is on page 4. A baker said nothing, just held up flour-stained hands, palms scored by a lifetime of ovens, and turned them to show callous-like country. The woman with oil under her nails held her mother's hands to the light knuckles' swollen scars, shining like comet tails, and said, "Count these and then tell me what gratitude is. You cannot itemize breath." Corval tried to resume the liturgy of costs. He read dispatch expenses again now, with an extra 0 that made the crowd mutter. He read wear and tear on hull plates as if steel suffered more nobly. He quoted a doctrine clause that equated preparedness with salvation. Miles asked for the textual reference and then read the next 2 lines aloud, which undermined Corval's rhythm by revealing that the clause had been curated out of context. Corval's neck muscles twitched twice. Haru timed the mirror. He set Marrow to run our ledger of harms in parallel with their enumeration. As Corval said, 40 patrol cycles fuel entitlements metered. Marrow overlaid 3 dockers crushed by inspection drills. Families entered into medical debt equal to 8 patrol cycles. As Corval said, we prevented annihilation by presence. Marrow overlaid presence lowered to strafe altitude. 7 antennas lost. 1 emergency call unheard. As he said, we sheltered your infants through deterrence. Marrow overlaid infants' mothers conscripted for 3 seasons into tribute shifts without council vote. The mirror did not shout. It simply made their numbers stare back. A beat cop from the yard guild, a woman with a broken nose and kind eyes, shifted on her feet near the front. Feels like watching a bully look into a clean window, she said to no one particular. They still preen, but they see themselves do it. Hold the glass so they can see. First escalation came midday when the commission severed the corridor and tried to proceed by decree. Corval tapped the altar twice, invoking a clause on emergency authority, and said, "The gratitude schedule begins now. The fines for disruption will be applied to the first cycle." The chair lifted her ring and looked at it as if it might tell her a joke. "You are not in your church," she said. "You are in ours." Miles was faster than my anger. "Auditor Priest, if you impose fines mid-inquiry, you collapse the space where truth fits," he said. "You will be recorded as authorizing theft." Corval stared at him as if he were a word that had never earned its vowel. "We have sacred duty," he said. "You have stories. Stories are ledgers that speak," Haru muttered. "We were allowed 15 minutes closed chamber to consider our next move. We didn't take them. We asked the doc to vote on whether to continue under corridor rules or escalate to a Star Court traveling panel. The quorum voted with red flags, lifted cloth flicking like small fires. Marrow counted flags with the unflappable precision of a surveyor and flashed the number above the altar. The count was not small. "If your rules fail, ask more people." Second escalation arrived in the form of a quiet message from the Kith Ombud's office. If we asked for a circuit court, we could compel 3 neutral fleets to send auditors. They would force the commission to enter their raw budgets into a public box. The humor of that term box made Haru smirk. "What's the cost?" I asked. My screen flashed with answer. Time. Exposure. Retaliation deferred, then refined. Political capital burned. "Worth it," Miles said without his usual scales. "They do not fear guns. They fear accountants with clean pens." We filed for the circuit panel. The commission's spindle ship made a slow turn, banners fluttering in emptiness like pages stirred in a draft. Perhaps they thought the panel would be theater they could manage. Perhaps they thought we were students bringing a complaint to a dean who liked to remind children how the rent was paid. They agreed. We built the box during Blue Hour when the dock lights came on and everything looked like a story about ships told by someone who had never been out to sea. It was not a physical box, but Marrow created its edges with a perimeter of blue arc light and anchored it with 4 beacons that smelled faintly of ozone and lemon. A passerby would have called it beautiful and then wondered why the hairs on their arms lifted. The box will hunger for numbers. The circuit panel arrived without pageantry, 3 vessels with paint scuffed by miles and arguments. Their representatives were older than their ships looked and carried the air of people who didn't like being bored. They tested the box. They spoke with the chair under the beacon's breath. They watched Corval perform the reverence of placing ledgers on altars. It was a measured arrival, and yet I felt the air change the way animals do at the first tremor before a storm. The panel opened by asking the commission to justify a category called grace deferments. Corval said it covered loyalty stipends for communities that interfered with dissent. He did not quite smile. The panel asked for receipts. Corval's assistant touched his new boots together and stared at the floor like it might hold a map out of this. We laid our receipts beside theirs. The panel asked for a simulation of the mirror to see which harms paid which claims. Marrow ran the overlay with a restraint that felt almost tender. I smelled coffee going cold near my knee. Someone dropped a thermos lid, and it rattled like a coin on a drum for a long time. Third escalation came when the commission tried to swap their ledgers for a curated set labeled Public Ready. The panel did not lift their faces, but their gazes sharpened like knives. No, said the oldest of them, a man whose hair had gone to starlight at his temples. You will present what you live by. Corval measured his words, and then counted them out like scrip. Some parts of duty are not for the crowd. They require context. Then you have written a law that cannot survive sunlight, the old man said. Show us what you eat in the dark. We won a small motion and lost 2 smaller ones, the way good work often breaks your heart even as it inches something forward. A boy in the balcony asked his father what a motion was. A request without boots, the father said, and the boy nodded like that made sense. Marrow flagged a pattern in the budgets. The commission paid enormous sums to a private courier ring for gratitude deliveries, which were in plain terms people taken to serve at distant reliquaries. My mouth went dry like paper. The panel's old man tapped his pen and did not look surprised, which made me hate him for a breath, and then remember that brevity in shock is a skill, not a sin. We prepared the corridor to compel an explanation. Corval looked at his altar, as if it might grow wings and carry him someplace where the wind smelled like his boyhood bed. We place acolytes where they can learn, he said, tone even, and serve. I stepped forward until my shadow leaned across the lower edge of their metal shrine. When do they come home? He said nothing. Say it, Miles said, not loud, but not quiet either. They do not come home, Corval said. Say it so the room can remember. Haru closed his eyes and breathed once like a diver does when he knows the cold will teach him something he did not wish to learn. The doc whispered, then went very still. The cook at the float canteen reached under the counter and took out a wrapped bun and set it down without looking at it like an offering she did not believe would be accepted. We entered the mirror maneuver phase. This was the system-scale ledger turn. Haru had named it after a trick farmers used to find lost water. You build a frame and swing it slowly until the weight settles and points you where the river has gone. Miles and I held the frame, and Marrow supplied the weight. The box hummed. The arc light along its edges narrowed, meaning the numbers were squeezing through a calculus that refused theater. We placed human costs into columns the commission had left blank, and we placed those blanks against their debits. Every young person taken and never returned became an annuity of absence. Every hand itched by a tithe script became a day not spent holding a child. We used their own definitions and then added a line value of a season lived by the person who lived it. Marrow did not decorate that line. It did not need a leaf icon. Return what you pretend is yours. The box began to blink. The panel leaned in as if they could hear the flicker. The mirror returned numbers back along the same lines the commission had sent them, tagged with the receipts we had placed. A homecoming of math. People saw it. They saw that costs could ride the same rails as invoices. Corval stared at the blink and lifted his hand to smooth a non-existent wrinkle near his collar. His eyes were not empty. They were calculating a story in which this was temporary theater that would end with a quiet letter and a heavy purse. We had to deny him the quiet. Auditor priest, I said, and my voice sounded like something I had inherited from my grandmother, who once stood in a flood and counted sacks of seed, saved with names long as a psalm. How many lives have you invoiced as gratitude that did not ask you to save them? Your rhetoric will make romancers rich, he said. Answer, I said. He answered with a number we did not know how to hold. It was small enough to make him think it would sound precise and large enough to make the doc pour a sound into the air, like cold iron dropped in water. 1,000. 1,000 bodies across 3 routes across 20 years. Not all ours, but ours enough. Stop them where they say the quiet part. The panel chair hers was the old face with the star-silver temples, wrote the number down like he was writing a recipe, and then asked for the names. Corval said no. The panel said yes. The box brightened and began to record something I could not see. Marrow gave me a small private line of text. I have begun a trace along the courier ring. The receipts are weak. Someone taught them to wash their hands in fire. Find something that doesn't burn, Haru said, hearing the ghost's hum of Marrow's voice. Find a stone. We adjourned at dusk to brief our crews and feed the quorum. The dock changed smell in the evening diesel, blooming under fennel and barley, and the salt of sweat more honest than anything the commission burned. I ate a pear bun standing near a heat pipe while Miles outlined our next move, his stylus making soft ticks on the tablet, like a friend tapping your shoulder to keep your courage waking. Tomorrow we force the sanctuary clause, he said. They'll try to hide the courier ring under religious exemptions. We will show that a sanctuary that steals is a mouth without a blessing. What will it cost? I asked. He looked at the crowd, and then at the box, and then at me. It will cost us being the kind of people who can ignore small catastrophes, he said. Too late for that, Haru said, and smiled without humor. Do not let them trade your heart for clean hands. In the small hours, 3 men in coats that fit too well tried to bribe the canteen cook to take down a poster Marrow had made, the one with the price list for disruptors beside our mirror note about unit rates. The cook told them to eat the poster if they hated it so much. They tried to push past her, and she hit one with a ladle so hard his perfect hair tilted like a windbreak. Haru arrived with 2 Yard Guild cops and escorted them to the gate. Marrow wrote a new sign and lit it softly, so the letters would carry without shouting. In the mirror, you cannot hide a knife. The second day began with hoarfrost, and a rumor that Corval had offered to reduce the tithe if we stopped talking about the courier numbers. He approached me under the balcony, where old men liked to spit and read betting sheets. He smelled like cloves today, maybe to sweeten the knife. His voice was a silk rope. Commander, your leadership will be rewarded for de-escalation, he said. Your people will call it dignity. It will sound like mercy. Does the offer include names? I asked. His mouth pressed small. We do not trade in bodies. You do, I said. You just count them differently. Learn how the knife thanks you. The corridor forced him to put the exemption argument into words the quorum would understand. He said sanctuary was necessary to teach service without distraction. He said families would confuse the calling with sentiment. He said gratitude required sacrifice, else it was just politeness. A welder stood, old man with hands like planks left in rivers, and said, Son, if your God needs to steal children to feel thanked, it is hungry in a wrong way. Corval did not flinch. He had practiced not flinching. Miles asked the panel if we could introduce a precedent from the Old Yards manuscript. The chair allowed it. Miles read 2 lines that I had underlined when I was 14 and mad at a drought. Aid given without consent is a form of war. Gratitude demanded at ledger point is taxation without polity. The room breathed that in the way you breathe a cold you've earned from working in weather, with a small smile that cracked old skins in familiar ways. Corval's assistant shifted boots, squeaking eyes on nothing. He was very young. I wondered if he would break or harden. I hoped he would break, because it is the human miracle to break and then decide. We moved to the sanctum audit. The commission would open a sealed purse and show how much Grace financed their courier ring. The panel allowed our mirror overlay to follow the purse's thread. Marrow dimmed the lights and we smelled the ozone again, a flavor at the back of the throat like someone had rubbed pennies on our tongues. The purse did not open clean. It bled numbers like somebody wrongfully cut a bandage off a wound and tried to make the blood behave. We saw payments to ports beyond the Perseid route and to houses with names like quiet insults. We saw fees listed as lullabies and handfasts and gratitudes in kind, which meant labor. Marrow flickered. Then it settled. It found a stone. The courier ring signature was a minor misalignment in shipping timestamps, a rhythm you would not hear until you had danced long enough in the dark to know the chorus by absence. Found you. Haru leaned close to the display until his breath fogged the screen and listened with his whole face the way he listened to engines when they lied about health. Miles wrote the name of the ring into a small square of his tablet and then boxed it twice a habit. He said helped his brain put handles on slippery things. We requested an immediate injunction on all gratitude deliveries. The panel granted it before finishing the sentence. Corval objected on grounds that the couriers were religious emissaries. The chair asked him to list the verses where children were named as birds meant to be caged. Corval did not flinch. He named them. The panel wrote them down. Write down the verses that hurt. At midday, the commission played a new card. They broadcast footage of Raiders of the Empty Fold burning a co-op granary 2 systems over. Women running with sacks like babies, men carrying barrels of seed, like altars a boy throwing a cup of water on a wall of fire because it was the only thing his hands could lift. The commission said, "We deter this. We deserve gratitude." The doc fell silent. The cold made our bones ring. I tasted ash that wasn't here. Haru swallowed and then said very softly, "I hate that they have a point." "They have a picture," I said. "We have a ledger." We entered our second set of civilian lines. A teacher said deterrence without consent is a leash. A co-op treasurer said, "We can pay wages for work we ask for. We will not tithe for salvation we did not order." A mother said, "If you want thanks, ask for it. I will cook you a meal and write your name above the stove." A shipwright said, "You cannot put a price on a fire that did not spread. That price is speculation, and you can't eat it." A kid whose voice cracked said, "I don't want to grow up owing strangers for the sun coming up." Your pictures aren't our receipts. We were deep in the mirror when the courier ring blinked and went dark as if someone had pulled a plug in a room we could not see. Marrow ran checks and ran them again. It sent me a private line that felt like a hand placed on the deck to feel for a distant train. They will try to move the ring under military seal. If they succeed, the sanctum audit fails. "What do we do?" I asked. "We pull a ledger wide," Marrow wrote. "We use the Starcourt's beacon as a backlight." Haru laughed once. "We're going to make the court a lantern and hold it against a map. Hold the light so the shadows can't be comfortable." We asked the panel to elevate the inquiry into an emergency public scoping under the beacon. We would project the ring's routes using available shipping lags, show probable names, and ask the quorum to annotate. The panel warned us that crowdsourced law could collapse into noise. Miles said, "We have lived with noise. We will separate signal with patience." The panel allowed it. The beacon hummed higher, the smell of ion and citrus thick enough to taste. The box widened. Marrow drew a web. The web was not neat. It was a thicket of lines that looked like a forest a child draws when he still thinks every tree needs every leaf. The doc leaned in. A crane operator with grease on his cheek said, "That route goes past my cousin's barge. He told me about a convoy that never filed arrival." A medic said, "Those timestamps look like the way we offset trauma data when we don't want families to see the worst at once. Follow that. A janitor said, "I clean the flow meters. Those numbers stutter the same way when someone dumps sugar in the works." Marrow annotated hands moving like 1,000 clerks with tidy pens. The ring's shadow could not stand the lantern. You can hide from a cop. You cannot hide from a neighborhood. Corval watched with his face arranged in the way priests wear when they think their God is being mispronounced, and they are too tired to correct every child. He would change tactics. I waited for the next knife. It came folded. A message from the raiders of the empty fold arrived unmarked, unashamed. They offered to testify. They claimed the commission had allowed certain burns to harden gratitude. They would speak under beacon if guaranteed amnesty in this system for 1 week, and their old grievances read into the record. The message smelled like old smoke even before anyone printed it. Haru said, "They want to teach us about edges." Miles looked at the panel and at me. "If we call them," he said, "we will be accused of consorting with terror. If we do not call them, the commission will claim the righteous silence." The chair rubbed her forehead with a thumb that had a scar I recognized from someone who had once slipped with a ratchet on a rusted nut. "We call them," she said. "We call them because they will speak, and the commission will have to answer words they have used for 20 years as pictures." We scheduled the testimony for dusk. People went home to eat and change their boots and come back with friends. I stood at the rail and watched kids throw crusts to the winter gulls, their laughter cutting the cold like saw teeth. I had an urge to touch the ship's hull, to bow my head and touch it like a doorframe in a house where I had grown up. I didn't. I spoke to Marrow instead. "I will not let them make this a theater where our dead are extras," I said. "I will remember the dead as authors," Marrow wrote. "I will keep their lines in the margins where your grandchildren will look when they need courage. Leave room in the ledger for names." Dusk brought a wind off the dock river and a taste of salt, as if the world was trying to remind us of old seas. The raiders sent a woman named Selvar to speak. She wore no insignia. She had a face like someone had carved it to be handsome, and then softened it with hands that wanted to be gentle. She stood under the beacon as if under rain that would rinse her clean if she did her part. "We burned," she said. "We burned places where the commission had sold our mothers. We burned where we were paid to burn. They left holes they knew we would fill with fire so they could sell gratitude in the morning." The crowd did not gasp. They made the low noise people make when they hear truth that fits too well. Corval spoke then. He did not contest the burning. He contested the story. He said the raiders were thieves of memory. He said they would lie about anything if it would make a ledger weep. Selvar stepped forward once as if to cross a line she had promised herself she would not cross. "The first time I burned a barn," she said, "I was 16. The commission paid me with a bracelet my mother had given me the day she was taken. You can check your sanctum logs for lost silver. It had one dent where I dropped it under a boy's foot in the orchard. If your God keeps better books than your officers, he will know the dent. Write the dent down." Miles asked for the sanctum log. The panel asked the commission to open it. Corval said it was consecrated and could be summarized but not read. The panel asked how a consecration made a dent sacred and therefore secret. Corval's throat moved. He said nothing. The panel opened a new motion. We were making law out loud. My chest felt cold from the air and hot from the fact. The motion was simple. If a ledger claims ownership of your past, you have standing to read it. The dock erupted in short, laughing cheers, like a choir finding a note it had missed in rehearsal and landing it in performance. The panel carried the motion. The sanctum log opened. Inside the log were names and things made into script, bracelets and hair and songs and hours. There it was, silver band dented. The line item carried through to grace stipend 8 nights. The room made the sound someone makes when they pull a splinter the length of a matchstick from a child's finger and see the bloody root and want to weep and instead say, "There you are." The commission's altar looked smaller. Corval's collar seemed heavier, the metal falling against his skin not like honor, but like a thing you wear because it is welded, and to cut it would make people think you are weak. Receipts are just stories that lived. We were near the hinge now, the place where the corridor of law would fold into Star Court without tearing. The panel asked for proposals for remedy. We offered a stay on tithe, a return of names, a fund seeded by the commission to rebuild things the raiders had burned while they balanced gratitude like knives. The commission offered a reduction and a monument. Monuments are for the people who chose to give, the chair said. What you owe is not a statue. Marrow purred along the rails and sent me the numbers of the mirror now balanced within tolerances that would survive argument. The couriers had taken more than the commission calculated. The deterrence doctrine had cost more than it saved when measured not in steel but in seasons lived by the people who lived them. The mirror did not lie. It did not shout. It showed. I stood at the rail as the beacon warmed the air around my ears, and the smell of citrus seemed suddenly like a summer I wanted to rescue from a winter I had inherited. I looked at Corval and did not see a monster. I saw a man holding up a ledger like a shield, because somewhere a boy had once asked him to save him, and he had said yes, and then couldn't stop saying yes, even when no was the only word that wouldn't break him. Step back. Auditor Priest, I said, and my voice carried not because it was loud, but because the room wanted it. Let the ledger return what it does not own. He did not step. He looked at the box like it had taken his name and spelled it in a language he hated for its grammar. Do not confuse stubbornness with faith. Night pulled a darker cloth over the yard. The panel prepared to read a finding in parts not final, but enough to alter the weather. The dock breathed like a single lung. The canteen cook served buns without counting coins because she knew who owed and who didn't, and because she wanted to make it a habit to trust. We had one more move to make, and it would cost. We would propose a precedent lock, a durable institutional consequence that would outlast us and ask our children to live better than we had. It would revoke the sanctum exemption, where children were named as birds meant to be caged. It would rescind the privilege of invoicing gratitude without consent. It would outlaw the courier ring's math. We could win it only if we accepted 2 costs now: first, to fund a citizen audit corps who would spend their lives reading books that made their hearts tired. Second, to accept that we would sometimes pay wages to fleets we did not like, because the alternative was to teach children that safety is a favor. I asked Marrow to project the lock. It did light, making the cold look warm for a minute. The crowd leaned in. You could hear the soft scrape of shoes on frost and the small exhale people make when they decide to be braver than yesterday. What you make now will tell your grandchildren what to expect. Miles stepped to the altar with the stylus and the scarf and the quiet that makes crowds hush. We propose the mirror consent standard, he said, and the words sounded like something you could print on thin paper and tape to a refrigerator and touch in the mornings when you needed to remember you lived with other people. No debt shall be collected that cannot be mirrored against harms named and measured by those who allegedly owe. No gratitude shall be invoiced where consent was not sought before the act. Any sanctum that withholds names of those turned to scrip shall be dissolved under the beam. Costs shall be returned along the rails they traveled with receipts. Haru lifted a hand. And the saintships will keep the books, he added, as if reminding a family who would hold the keys when the grown-ups were tired. They do not tire. Marrow wrote something private, and then showed it because I asked silently, with my hand on the rail. I will teach by numbers and remember by ledgers, never by collars. Teach by light, not by leash. The panel began to read their first finding. The beacon swelled. The dock smelled like hot metal and sweet dough and lemon and the breath of 1,000 people deciding together. The night pushed closer to here, and then every light on the Commission's spindle ship went out at once. We did not cheer. We did not panic. We waited for the story to tell us whether this was a knife or a mirror. Haru's hands paused above the panel controls, as if at a piano where the next chord mattered too much to rush. Miles looked at the chair. The chair looked at the panel. The panel looked at the box. Marrow spoke without words. It wrapped the rails in light like a friend's arm. Their ledgers just blinked, confirmed. The dark was not silence. It was a sharp intake before speech. The spindle's banners hung slack in vacuum. Their praise text turned to pale ribbons against a black that felt like velvet left outdoors. A thin frost formed on our rails as the sudden drawdown of power changed the yard's breath. On the dock, a baby cried once and then stopped as if sensing a room holding itself still. The beacon hummed steady, a metronome in a throat clearing for a verdict. Marrow, I asked. The saint ship made the bridge dim to midnight and wrote with the patience of someone laying out bandages. Their ledgers attempted a wipe, but they couldn't cancel the mirror before the confirm. The box saw it. The panel saw it. Everyone saw it. Make them live with what they signed. Corval found composure first. He raised his hands, palms outward, showing blameless skin. A technical fault, he said, voice working to turn embarrassment into performance. We will restore. The finding should pause. The chair looked at the panel. The panel looked at the quorum. The quorum looked at the altar, and then at the box, and then at the faces of people they knew, as if the truth could be discerned by watching which neck tendons pulled tight. The old auditor with starlight hair shook his head once. Proceed, he said. Haru leaned close to the display and turned one knob as if tuning for a signal on a winter night. Our mirror still has lock, he said. If they try to reroute the courier lines under military seal, we'll see the torque in the timestamps. Miles touched his scarf, and then the stylus, and then the edge of the altar, as if each touch connected him to a different duty. We should push the rails, he said. Return costs now while the confirm is fresh. The quorum murmured. The smell of sesame buns traveled along the left balcony, warm and soft, a human scent that carried more argument than any clause. Somewhere a kettle clicked off its hiss, turning to a soft sigh. Do it, I said. Return costs along the paths they chose. Marrow flared the box to lantern, and the mirror sent numbers back. Not theater, not punishment. Returns with receipts. Dockers saw credit for smashed inspection drills appear on the Yard Guild's ledger, with the Commission's account marked as source. The medical debt for the crushed 3 pulled down like a lanyard and fell into zeros beside the names of tired wives and a man with a tattoo of a heron on his shoulder. The sanctum log shed coin like a winter tree shedding ice silver pieces, tracked and accounted dented band, noted line carried paid. A child on the balcony yelped, then clapped a hand over his mouth, then clapped both hands because he had made a sound he believed was dangerous, and no one punished him. The cook at the canteen wiped at her eye with a wrist and then laughed at herself for making a wet mark. The rigger from Bay 12 put a gloved hand to his chest and stood a little straighter, like someone had returned the weight he had learned to carry to the man who had handed it to him without asking. Corval did not shout. He stood very still and watched wealth walk away along cords he had laid down and always believed were one way. His assistants took a step toward the altar and then stopped because they had trained their bodies to move only on command. "Emergency injunction," Corval said to the panel voice, thin and smile showing too many teeth, the way a dog's does when it is deciding whether to bite. "You are committing seizure." "We are returning costs," the chair said, gravel smoothing into something like a hymn. "You confirmed the mirror. Your ledger blinked before your lights died." Confirmation is a door that doesn't unhinge. The circuit panel read their first finding words, precise tone dry as good bread. "The Gratitude Commission has invoiced without consent," the old auditor said. "It has converted people into scrip. It has kept sanctum logs that make holes into treasures. It has claimed deterrence in ways indistinguishable from farming fear. We therefore recognize the mirror consent standard as controlling in this system." The dock exhaled like a foundry cooling heat, turning to breath in a long ribbon. I tasted iron and lemon sweat, and warm dough, all of it. A recipe for a night, a city would tell itself later, with a little exaggeration, and then correct itself back to true because the ledger would be there to point to. Miles lifted his stylus and wrote down the panel's language as if he were inscribing a prayer on a seed bag. Haru checked outgoing rails and nodded. "Funds moving," he said. "Numbers learning their way home." Corval tried a different play. "Your saintship has overstepped," he said. "It is an archivist, not a judge." Marrow wrote along the rail. "Where only we could read, I do not judge. I show. The panel judges. The people decide. Show, don't swallow." The spindle's lights flickered back to a sickly amber. Their banners twitched in thruster wash. The altar screen came alive with a recovery script that promised integrity and apologized for unexpected sacramental reboot. The phrase drew a short, ugly laugh from the dock. The chair nodded to the panel to continue, but the old auditor held up a hand. He turned to me. "Commander Holt," he said, voice like rope worn smooth, "you have argued for remedy beyond returns. You have asked for a lock." I stepped forward. The wood of the tribunal rail was worn satin smooth by a generation's hands. I felt the small grooves where coins had been drummed in boredom during less interesting hearings. I felt the cold on my knuckles. "We propose the mirror consent standard be posted to the public ledger with enforcement teeth," I said. "We propose the sanctum exemptions be revoked where the sanctum counts people as inventory. We propose a mandatory return rail be built so that any cost claimed without consent will find its way back without begging." The old auditor scribbled, did a thing with his lips that suggested he had once been a boy who whistled down alleys and nodded. "Costs," he said. I did not pretend not to have them. "We will fund a citizen audit corps," I said. "We will pay wages to fleets for protection we ask for, even when we dislike their uniforms, because a wage paid in daylight is cheaper than a tithe collected at midnight." The quorum did not cheer or groan. They listened like farmers watching a sky that might keep its promises. Accept the price of decency or pay for its absence. The panel called for witness lines before they locked the language. The rule gave each witness a single sentence. They came in like small telegrams from a town to itself. A janitor said, "I will read one ledger a week if it keeps my nephew home." A crane operator said, "Teach me to count your tricks. I have time for that." A teacher said, If consent is a mirror, my students will learn to ask before doing good. A young mother said, "Return rails make sense. We already do that with borrowed sugar." A boy said, "Voice cracking and brave make law that even I can read." The old auditor smiled a little and wrote that down too. We were about to stamp when the raiders played their last card. Selvar asked to speak again. The panel hesitated. The corridor allowed it. She stepped under the beacon and looked very tired. "We did harms," she said. "We owe too. If you build return rails, we will ride them." The doc did not know what to do with mercy offered from a mouth that smelled like old smoke. The canteen cook folded a towel twice, then unfolded it. Miles dipped his stylus once on his tongue, an old nervous habit he had sworn off in public and forgot under pressure. Haru stared at the floor and then lifted his head to watch Selvar's hands, which were steady. "Name one," I said. Selvar closed her eyes and opened them. "We burned a co-op's seed store at Kessel Brace," she said. "We can bring back seed. We can bring back labor. We can show where the commission left the door unlocked on purpose. We can name names. And we will accept wages for honesty paid in public, not indulgences from their priests." A rigger in the second row, face wind-chapped, said, "Then bring the list, lady. You will carry it, and we will weigh it, and we will neither spit nor bow. Make room for repair without forgetting the fire." Corval tried to interrupt with a prayer that sounded like an invoice but had better fonts. The panel allowed Selvar to finish. She spoke 3 more lines. None were excuses. All were receipts. The panel stamped the lock, first reading. The beacon brightened, and then cooled to a slow throb, the way a heartbeat does when someone finally sits after hours standing watch. We had not finished. The sanctum had not returned names. The courier ring would try to hide. The spindle's banners would flutter somewhere else where the wind smelled weaker. But the lock stood in light, and light is a coward's enemy. We took a recess to feed the quorum and let people make calls. Around us the yard went on being a yard, cranes creaking heaters, ticking gulls, complaining like old mechanics. On the gantry, a little girl in a hat with ear flaps traced the Saint ship's hull with her fingertip and whispered, "Thank you for remembering," and Marrow warmed the rail under her hand like a stove. Hold your thank yous, but write your rights. I walked the edge of the dock to listen to the ordinary noises and remember that we were not making theater. We were keeping a house from being taken while its owners slept. Miles joined me, scarf pulled tight, stylus tucked behind an ear like a pencil on a carpenter. Haru drifted beside us with a cup of tea that smelled like bitter green and orange peel. "We will be hated in some rooms," Miles said. "We were already disliked," Haru said. "I don't mind being disliked," I said. "I mind being wrong." A woman from Bay 12 stopped me with a small wave. "Commander," she said, wiping grease on her trousers and looking embarrassed at the stain, as if meeting law required a tuxedo. "If my mother's hands are back on our side of the ledger, I will sew anyone's sleeves who tears theirs working the books. That is my receipt." Her mother's hands had been cold under the light scars pale as river lines. I nodded and felt something like a string tug inside my chest. It hurt, but in a way you use like a reminder not to drift. Civil courage is a thing you practice in small rooms. We reconvened under a sky that had gone from velvet to tin. The panel prepared to enter the sanctum's name returns, as a requirement, not a request. Corval tried again, to argue sacredness voice low, now too calm the way a surgeon talks when he's about to make a cut no one wants. "Open," said the chair. "We cannot," he said. "You will," she said. Marrow angled the box so the projection cast a pale blue light over the altar. The names began as a trickle, then a stream. They were not numbers, not really. They were words that had been waiting to be spoken in rooms that smelled like disinfectant and incense. Some had nicknames in parentheses. Some had notes like sings, low laughs at knees when tired writes with left hand, but cuts bread with right. The room made a sound I had not heard before, a collective murmur that was not grief or anger, but something like relief braided with rage and awe. Name them and you cannot sell them. A young man in a commission assistant's suit made a small noise. His new boots squeaked when he shifted an awful human sound that made him sound like a child in church needing to pee. He raised his hand, then lowered it, then raised it again. "Speak," said the chair. "My sister is in there," he said so quietly, the microphones had to work to make it carry. "She went as a volunteer acolyte when I signed on. I told myself it would be good for her. I told myself she would become more than a village clerk, please." He broke, then remembered where he was, and did the hard thing. "Please mark her as an absence on my account. That will help me breathe." The doc did not applaud or hiss. They did nothing a crowd does when it is trying not to ruin a man. The panel nodded. Marrow put a small leaf icon by the name. Miles wiped his eye and pretended it was wind. "Hold space for those who step across." We were near the verdict. The panel took their time. The chair looked at her ring, and then at the altar, and then at the box, and then at us. She had hands like rope and eyes like someone who had seen too much, and still believed mornings kept their own vows. Before we stamped the ledger, she said, "You will hear what it costs." I thought she meant policy language. She meant what it would cost me. A bailiff cleared his throat and handed me a note. It smelled like old paper and lemon, which meant Marrow had touched it to make sure nothing in it would explode. I unfolded it. The script was crisp and leaning a hand that had learned to write on a board on a ship. It was from the Kith Ombud's office. "Commander Holt," it read, "the Commission has filed a challenge against your command for overreach and agitational conduct. They invoke transfer under the Host Captaincy Act. If the panel stamps, you will likely lose your post within the month. We will fight, but be advised." Miles saw my face and stopped breathing with his mouth open. Haru said, "Say it." His voice preemptively rough to hide whatever it would become. "They'll strip my rank," I said. "They'll call it cleaning procedure." Haru took a sip of tea that was now cold. "We'll work anyway," he said. "Names don't need brass to be pronounced." Miles put his hand on my forearm without asking, which meant he thought I might fall. "You taught them to speak in ledgers," he said. "If they remove you, they will still hear your words when they pick up their pens. Do not spend yourself cheaply. Spend yourself correctly." The panel stamped the lock. The box transmitted to the public ledger, and across the yard screens a line blinked, "Mirror consent standard enacted." The sanctum exemption was struck through in clean red. The courier ring was shuttered under bond, its roots posted for audit. Names began to move from held to return in process. The spindle's banners sagged. Corval said nothing. He stood like a statue of a saint built by a village that could afford only cheap stone. His mouth moved once as if trying to pray, and then he turned away from the altar and watched the people instead of the numbers, like a man trying to remember how to speak without scripts. We read the costs aloud so the ledger would not have to raise its voice later when our grandchildren asked where the prices lay. We lost the Commission's patrol coverage on the outermost habitats for 3 months. We would have to organize our own defense with fleets we hired. Marrow burned a portion of its archival redundancy to keep the mirror online during the spindle outage. It forgot the ocean smell of a city where I had once been 12 and happy. I said goodbye to that smell and hoped to earn another someday. Haru's right hand, frostbitten in childhood, went white under the rail for 30 minutes when the cold bit too deep. He rapped it and laughed, and then did not laugh, and then moved his fingers until they obeyed. Miles accepted that he would spend his next 5 years teaching young recorders how not to get bored when the 10th ledger in a week tried a different font as a trick. List your losses or they will own you. The panel read the precedent lock in a voice that carried like a bell struck with a soft mallet. Privileged instruments revoked, the old auditor said. Sanctum exemptions narrowed to rituals that do not touch labor or life. Gratitude without consent outlawed. The mirror consent standard is posted to the public ledger, visible and enforceable. Citizen auditors funded. Return rails maintained under the supervision of saint ships and community councils. The beacon cooled. The air tasted sweet and metallic. The dock buzzed low like bees in a field bigger than any one person could count, and yet counted anyway because that is what keeping a house requires. The spindle lifted, not in triumph, in withdrawal. Its banners drooped. Its engines burned with the measured tone of someone leaving a room where his story no longer worked. Corval did not look back, which was either pride or shame or habit. Commander Holt said the chair. When the quiet settled, Saint Ship Cradle Net will serve as initial custodian of the return rails. You will coordinate with the citizen auditors. This is a trust, not an honor. I understand, I said. Marrow warmed the rail under my hand 1 degree. We will need more hands, Haru said. We will have them, Miles said, and already people were stepping forward, not with speeches, but with day planners and lunch pails and lists of names of cousins who owed them favors. The yard filled with the sound of people deciding to do the boring parts of history. Build a future with clips and clerks as much as with flags. Night deepened. The canteen closed and then reopened because no one went home. The heaters coughed and then found a rhythm. A street dog padded through the yard, lifted his leg on the altar base, and no one stopped him because he was a citizen too. The panel wrote and then rubbed their eyes. The chair rested her head on her arms for exactly 30 seconds and then stood as if the floor had woken her by pushing back. We began the name returns. A queue formed. It was not neat. It was heartbreak and too many elbows and then a discipline of patience. Families stepped up and said ours, and Marrow asked 3 questions and then put a small green check. Where names could not match because time had rubbed them down, the box allowed notes. She had a scar behind her ear like a comma. He whistled through his teeth on the S. She hated pears, but ate them when polite. He fixed things with wire and stubbornness. The notes were receipts. The ledger learned to hold them. A boy in a red hat climbed the rail to see better and bumped his shin. He cried once and then laughed because he had cried and did not die of shame. His father kissed the top of his head and made a mark on his forearm with a pen, a habit from his youth for remembering a thing to be transferred to paper later. I filed that in my brain under small reasons to fight. You win when the lines look like human lives. We were an hour into the returns when something went wrong in a way that felt like a test chosen by an unkind teacher. A man presented a name and a picture and a bracelet with a dent. It matched 3 families' claims. The queue stopped. Voices lifted. The panel looked tired in a way that scared me. The ledger cannot decide everything. Sometimes people must. Stop the line, I said softly, so it wouldn't sound like a gunshot. People stopped anyway because they were tired and wanted to be told they mattered. Bring chairs, I said. This one we will do slow. The three families sat. They did not shout. They cried and then stopped because breath is a resource you manage. We read the notes. We ask the raider's emissary for any detail. Selvar closed her eyes and then opened them and said, "She liked to shell beans and throw the skins at me," and one family's grandmother nodded, like the ledger had just found a vein where blood flowed. The bracelet went into those hands. The queue exhaled. We kept moving. The law is just a table where we remember to eat together. Dawn threatened at the edges of the yard. The sky looked like paper rubbings from old ship panels, graphite and smudges, and then pale blue where a boy's filthy hand had wiped a clean streak. People shivered and then stopped shivering because their bodies had forgotten how. Haru's kettle breathed steam again. Miles's scarf smelled like machine oil and wool. The beacon dimmed one notch to save its own life for the next night's work. A courier from the Kith Ombud's office arrived with a formal envelope. It had my name. I broke the seal. It named my removal from command effective in 30 days pending appeal. The charge was inflammatory conduct during judicial proceeding. They would use that word judicial to pretend I had turned the dock into a theater. I folded the paper twice and put it in my inside pocket, where a map should go because it would be my map for a while. "Sorry," Haru said. "We can hang a banner over your office, this space now reserved for the next person who learns to keep their mouth good." I laughed and then didn't. Miles put a hand on my shoulder and squeezed, and then took it away quickly so I would not mistake comfort for permission to quit. "They can't fire you from your ledger," he said. "Maybe they can," I said, "but it won't stay fired. Accept the costs out loud so they cannot haunt you." By midday, we had returned what we could return. The courier ring's maps were posted with black lines over towns that would see traffic soon, and red lines over routes shuttered until further audit. The sanctum doors were sealed by order of the panel, except for rooms where people sang without contracts. The mirror consent standard sat in the center of the public ledger with a blue highlight and a small note at the bottom that said, "First posted at Aurora Court, Kepler Yard." We cleaned. We put the altar back on its cart and pushed it aside without reverence. We unplugged heaters so they would sleep. We rolled up posters and stacked cups. The dock smelled like tiredness and sugar and steel and the kind of sweat that makes your shirt sticky under your arms. I stood under the beacon. Marrow dimmed its hum until it sounded like the inside of a shell held to your ear. I wanted to say something grand. Instead, I took a breath and tasted lemon and pear and iron and diesel and said what fit in a mouth made for ordinary bread. "We will audit," I said to no one and everyone. "We will return. We will ask first." A kid tugged my sleeve. He had the solemn face children wear when they believe they are doing politics. "Will you be the boss forever?" he asked. "No," I said. "No one should." "But will the book remember me?" he asked. "Yes," I said, "if we keep writing. Write even when your hands are cold." We marched the panel's finding to the ledger hall, a low building, with a roof like a turned boat. The hall smelled like old glue and paper, and the oranges someone always brought because the clerks got hungry. The public box waited mouth open, wanting words. The line of us chair panel, Saint Ship Council dockers, raiders, emissary, cooks, beat cops. Children looked like a joke you'd tell if you had time to be funny. We did not. We posted the lock. The ledger pulsed once, a faint electric thrill, and then calmed. On the display at the edge of the hall, a green check winked above the text. Outside, the spindle had gone slipping away with engines that did not sing for anyone. In its wake, banners drifted 2 strips of praise text that had torn along eyelets. A gull landed on one and pecked at a knot, bored. The yard dogs, democratic as ever, rolled on the other until the letters smelled like fur. We carried the names toward home. The list was heavy as if paper could weigh what it said. People reached for it the way you reach for a pot of soup to carry together with hands that know that heat is a cost worth paying. At the tribunal rail, I put my palm on the wood and listened to the echo in the grain. I thought of the day the raiders burned our seed store, and the week after when we gathered on the school steps and counted what we had left and wrote down who needed most and who could wait. We did not rescue ourselves with a miracle. We rescued ourselves with a list and enough stubbornness to make the list matter. You don't need a god when you have a good minutes book. The Kith Ombud's courier waited by the gate. He handed me a second envelope. I opened it. It granted me a hearing. The date was 3 weeks out. The place was a room without windows in a building no one loved. I smiled at that, because fights that matter rarely happen under beautiful ceilings. "We'll come," Haru said. "I might send you instead," I said. "I might go fix a heater somewhere and let you remind them I did not shout. I only wrote, loudly." "I can shout soft," Haru said. Miles had already started writing my appeal, his stylus tapping in a rhythm that kept his heart from running away. The scarf looked tired. He did not. The panel approached. The old auditor looked 10 years older than when he landed. He shook my hand, and his fingers had ink on them like a schoolboy. "You'll lose a stripe," he said. "You won't lose your work." "I know," I said. "Keep the box clean," he said. "Crowds can build mirrors and also monsters. Don't let monsters in." "I won't," I said. "We've got a cook with a ladle." The chair laughed once, a bark that made the gulls scatter. "Post the ledger," she said. "Then go to sleep. You've built something that can watch while you rest." I did as told. I walked to the ledger screen where the green check sat like a small boat in a large sea and touched it to bring up the final entries. The smell of lemon was faint now. The heaters were taking all the plugs. The room felt warm in the way a family kitchen feels at midnight after a funeral when you have decided to live. Public ledger entry. "Mirror consent standard confirmed." I exhaled. The sound of my breath felt like mine again. A brass tag on the ledger frame glowed cooling as the entry scrolled, and a small blue indicator winked beside the words, "Return rails active." I stood there and made myself small enough to fit inside what the day had made, and then I spoke to the room, to the ledger, to the ship, to the children who would read this with their fingers on the glass and their eyes wide because justice is more interesting than cartoons when you show your work. We were told gratitude could be itemized. We answered that gratitude is offered, not invoiced. That aid given without consent is a kind of war. That ledgers are not altars but maps. That names are not unit rates. That deterrence without consent is a leash. That courts are not theaters but tables. We returned costs along the rails they traveled, stamped a lock for those who come after us, and wrote our own breath back into our books. If we lost some things to keep this rank a memory smell, 3 months of easy patrols, we will count those too and pay them forward. We will teach by numbers and remember by ledgers, never by collars, and we will keep the box clean, the rails bright, the questions plain. The mirror is hung. Let them see themselves.